In the middle of August 1969, 500,000 young people converged on a 600-acre dairy farm in Bethel, New York, and for 3 days, technically 4, if you count the rain soaked over time, turned a quiet patch of Sullivan County into the most talked-about gathering of the 20th century. We all know the highlight reel. Hendrix's guitar screaming through the Star-Spangled Banner, a sea of mud, and a crowd so big it could be seen from the air. But behind the famous concert footage sits a mountain of photographs that rarely make it into documentaries. Quieter, stranger, funnier, and sometimes sadder frames that never got their moment in the spotlight. Woodstock has been retold so many times, in so many films and anniversary specials, that it's easy to forget it wasn't actually planned to become the cultural landmark we talk about today. It was a business venture that nearly collapsed a dozen times before a single band ever played a note. A canceled venue, a farmer with second thoughts, a budget that ballooned far past what anyone had approved, and a crowd that showed up in numbers nobody could have prepared for. The photographs that survived from that weekend tell a much messier, much more human story than the polished legend most of us grew up with. Today, we're digging through that mountain of lesser-known images. These are the Woodstock photos that couldn't be seen before, and the stories tucked inside them. Let's get into it. Before there was a festival, there was a problem. The original venue, an industrial park in the town of Wallkill, backed out weeks before showtime after local officials passed an ordinance effectively banning the event. With time running out and $500,000 already spent on advertising, the promoters were desperate. That's when Max Yaska, a dairy farmer with no particular taste for rock music, offered up his land. One surviving photograph shows him standing at the edge of his own alfalfa field, hands on his hips, watching stagehands hammer together scaffolding on the pasture where his cows used to graze. He wasn't a hippie. He wasn't political, and by his own account, he mostly just didn't like being told what he could or couldn't do with his property. That stubborn streak is the reason Woodstock exists at all. Woodstock was never supposed to be free. Organizers built ticket booths, printed thousands of tickets, and expected people to actually use them. A photo taken on the Wednesday before the festival shows rows of freshly built box office windows sitting empty in a field, waiting for a crowd that was already arriving faster than anyone could process. By Friday afternoon, the fences meant to funnel people through those booths had literally been trampled flat, and organizers made the now legendary decision to simply let everyone in. Somewhere in Bethel, there's a photograph of unsold ticket rolls sitting in a cardboard box, a quiet monument to a plan that lasted about 24 hours. Because long after the mud dried and the crowds went home, Max Yaska's land became something of a pilgrimage site, with fans returning over the years to walk the same hillside where the stage once stood. A series of later photographs, taken well after the festival itself, show the field looking almost unrecognizable, quiet, green, and empty, save for a small monument marker placed near the original stage location. Eventually, the site was developed into the Bethel Woods Center for the Arts, a performing arts venue built specifically to preserve the memory of what happened there, ensuring the farm's second act would be just as tied to music as its first. What these lesser-known photographs really capture isn't the music. It's everything that happened around it. The traffic jams, the rainstorms, the makeshift kitchens, the strangers who became temporary neighbors on a stranger's farm, and the small, human moments that never made it into the official highlight reels. Woodstock has been mythologized for decades as a symbol of peace, freedom, and generational change, and in many ways it earned that reputation. But it was also messy, improvised, occasionally dangerous, and held together largely by the goodwill of the people who showed up. It's worth remembering, too, that none of it was inevitable. A farmer could have said no. A road could have been built wider, or not at all. A storm could have scattered the crowd, instead of bringing them closer together. Instead, hundreds of thousands of strangers found themselves stuck in the same mud, waiting out the same rain, sharing the same short supply of food and shelter, and somehow it never tipped over into chaos the way so many organizers feared it would. That, more than any single performance, might be the real reason Woodstock is still talked about more than half a century later. Not because everything went right, but because of how gracefully everyone involved handled everything that went wrong. That's arguably the more interesting story. Not the legend, but the reality underneath it. And these forgotten photographs are the closest thing we have to seeing it firsthand. Not a polished poster or a movie trailer, but the actual unglamorous, occasionally chaotic weekend that somehow still managed to become one of the defining moments of a generation. More than 50 years later, Woodstock still gets brought up whenever people talk about what a festival, a protest, or even just a crowd is capable of when it's left mostly to organize itself. Every anniversary brings a new wave of documentaries, reissues, and retrospectives, and yet there always seem to be a few more photographs surfacing from someone's attic or an old newspaper archive nobody had scanned before. Maybe that's fitting for an event that was never fully planned in the first place. Even the way we remember it keeps getting filled in, one forgotten photograph at a time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this trip back to the summer of 1969, stick around, because there's more history waiting just around the corner. The final well-known images from the festival don't show a stage at all. They show the roads leading away from it, packed with young people walking for miles, thumbs out for rides, carrying whatever they could still manage after 4 days without a proper shower or a real meal. Tired, sunburned, and covered in dried mud, most of them had no idea yet that the weekend they just lived through would still be talked about more than half a century later. Local and regional radio stations were caught almost as off guard as the festival organizers themselves. Surviving audio clips and a handful of photographs from broadcast trucks parked near the property show reporters standing on car roofs just to get a signal out, describing scenes they clearly weren't prepared to narrate. 500,000 people, a farm transformed into a small city, and roads so jammed that even news vans couldn't get within miles of the stage. One local disc jockey reportedly told listeners on air that the New York State Thruway itself was effectively closed because of the festival traffic, a sentence that sounded absurd until it turned out to be completely true. Concession stands had been contracted to feed the crowd, but most were built to handle a fraction of the people who actually showed up, and several shut their doors entirely once supplies ran out on the very first day. Photographs from behind the food stalls show empty shelves, unopened crates that never arrived because delivery trucks couldn't get to the traffic, and vendors simply locking up and walking away from their own booths. It's a small detail, but it explains a lot about why the free food operation run by volunteers ended up mattering as much as it did, with every inch of open ground eventually claimed by blankets, tents, and sleeping bags. Some attendees got creative about where to plant themselves. Photographs show groups perched in tree branches overlooking the crowd, using ropes and makeshift platforms to stay put for hours at a time just to get a clear line of sight to the stage. It wasn't exactly safe, and more than one person reportedly fell out trying to get a better view. But for a few days, the trees around the farm doubled as some of the best seats in the house. 4 days without a change of clothes, combined with 2 major rainstorms, left plenty of festival goers with soaked, muddy clothing and nowhere to dry it. Photographs from the outer edges of the crowd show T-shirts, jeans, and ponchos strung between tent poles, tree branches, and even parked cars, turning parts of the campground into an impromptu open-air laundromat. It's a small, mundane detail that says a lot about how quickly 500,000 strangers organized themselves into something resembling a functioning temporary town. Away from the stage, a small crew of documentary filmmakers spent the weekend capturing footage that would eventually become the award-winning Woodstock documentary, released the following year. Behind-the-scenes photographs show crew members hauling heavy, unwieldy camera equipment through knee-deep mud, climbing towers alongside the crowd, and sleeping in Hoffman off the stage after Hoffman grabbed the microphone to make a political statement mid-set. It remains one of the odder, less publicized collisions of music and politics from the entire weekend. As Sunday morning broke, photographers on the hill captured a crowd that looked less like festival goers and more like survivors, blankets wrapped around shoulders, faces streaked with dried mud, eyes fixed on a stage that hadn't stopped since the night before. There's a quiet, almost peaceful quality to these particular photos, a contrast to the chaos of the days before, as thousands watched the sun come up together after a night that many said they'd never forget. Joe Cocker's now iconic performance of With a Little Help from My Friends took place on Sunday afternoon, and photographs show him in his signature spasmodic style, playing an invisible guitar mid-song. Almost immediately after his set ended, a second violent thunderstorm rolled through, forcing a lengthy delay in turning the grounds, already soaked from the earlier storm, into a genuine mudslide. Some of the most striking photographs of the entire festival come from this exact window, showing people literally sliding down hillsides on their backs, laughing the whole way down. With roads still impassable well into Sunday, Organizers arranged for military and National Guard helicopters to ferry in food, medical supplies, and even some performers who had no other way of reaching the site. Photographs of these aircraft landing in an open field, rotors kicking up mud in every direction while hundreds of onlookers watched, are among the more unusual images of the weekend. A strange collision of counterculture and military hardware that few predicted going in. Crosby, Stills, and Nash performed one of their very first shows as a group at Woodstock, and Stephen Stills is famously quoted from the stage admitting the band was scared as less, playing only their second gig ever in front of the largest crowd any of them had ever seen. Photographs from backstage show the trio huddled together tuning acoustic guitars, looking considerably less confident than the polished harmonies they go on to become known for. With food vendors overwhelmed and unable to keep up with demand, a small army of volunteers, many from the hog farm commune, set up an informal kitchen that handed out granola, oatmeal, and vegetables donated or bought locally. Photographs show enormous pots being stirred over open fires, with lines of hungry festival goers waiting patiently for a scoop of whatever was available. It wasn't glamorous, but it may have done more to keep the festival peaceful than any security measure could have. 10 years after it took the stage deep into the festival's second night, and guitarist Alvin Lee's blistering, nearly 10-minute solo during I'm Going Home became one of the most talked-about instrumental performances of the weekend. A rarely seen photo captures him mid-solo. The massive scaffolding towers built to hold the festival's speaker stacks were engineering marvels of their time, custom-built by sound designer Bill Hanley, to project music across an audience that size. Photographs show people climbing the scaffolding anyway, perched dozens of feet in the air alongside the speaker cabinets, using the towers as makeshift bleachers with the best view on the property. It wasn't part of the plan, and it certainly wasn't safe, but by day 2 nobody was stopping them. With medical staff dramatically outnumbered by attendees, a series of large canvas tents became the closest thing to a hospital the farm had. Photos from inside show volunteer doctors and nurses treating cut feet, heat exhaustion, and bad drug reactions on cots lined up in rows, working by lantern light once the sun went down. Supplies ran short quickly, and at several points helicopters had to be used to fly more antiseptic, bandages, and staff from nearby towns because the roads were simply impassable. By some estimates, medical volunteers treated several thousand people over the course of the weekend, ranging from minor cuts and sunburn to far more serious cases, all with staff that had originally been sized for a crowd a fraction of the one that actually showed up. Several of the doctors who volunteered later said the experience felt less like working a concert and more like running triage after natural disaster, minus a disaster, just an overwhelming, non-stop stream of ordinary people who needed a bandage, a cool place to sit, or simply someone to talk them through a bad reaction. Woodstock's unofficial voice belonged to a stage announcer whose calm, almost deadpan delivery became as recognizable as any of the performers. Photographs from beside the stage show him leaning into a single microphone, clipboard in hand, delivering updates about everything from missing persons to weather warnings in the same even tone he might have used to introduce a band. His most quoted line, a gentle warning to the crowd about specific batches of drugs going around that weekend, has been replayed in documentaries for decades, less because of what he said than because of how strangely composed he managed to sound while saying it to nearly 500,000 people at once. At various points across the weekend, performers and organizers used the stage microphone not for music, but for public service. One well-known photograph captures a moment when the crowd was asked to move back on the stage to make room for an ambulance, a request that, remarkably, 500,000 people actually managed to follow. Announcements about lost children, missing friends, and available water stations were as much a part of the soundtrack as the band themselves, turning the stage into something closer to a town hall than a concert venue. Country Joe McDonald's solo set became one of the most photographed moments of the festival, largely because of a call and response chant he led.